Okay, so today I am supposed to speak about the French resistance, myth, history, and I would like to say that the French resistance today enjoys a quite ambivalent status, because for a long time it has been considered as a phenomenon of major importance. This optimistic view relied upon three main pillars. First, thanks to the Shadow Army, France had been able to liberate itself alone. This statement understated that the Allies had played no role in the liberation of the country, which was, as you may suppose, quite a biased view. All the French, on the other hand, were supposed to have participated to the resistance. This conception was both enforced by the communists and by the Gaullists. All of them pretended that Vichy had just been a puppet state deprived of any legitimacy. Resistance, at last, and I think it's very important to mention that and to stress on that, resistance was considered as a military phenomenon. This conception stated that what we call civil resistance was of no importance compared to the maquis or to the partisan struggle. And one example clearly shows this vision. As you know, a great strike had burst out in 1941, May-June 1941, in the Nord-Pas-de-Calais. So coal miners have striked, and more than 270 coal miners had been deported to Germany. But they have not been considered as resistors until 1962. Why? Because they were, the French authorities said, they were struggling for wage augmentation, for wages increase. So they had led just a corporatist fight, and certainly not a resistance one. From the end of the 60s, however, this vision, as you know, has collapsed, and a new conception has emerged. Now, the resistance appears to be a minority instead of majority phenomenon. Civil resistance, and of course the rescue of the Jews, has taken a greater part, while the military dimension has quite totally vanished. And the resistance, as we can say that, has been attacked in the last 20 years. Some accused, for example, Jean Moulin, who has been the de Gaulle's delegate in occupied France, to have been a communist and even to have been a Soviet agent, which is even in France not really a compliment. All these events also, Lucie and Raymond Braque, you certainly know this famous couple of resistors, have also been accused to have betrayed Jean Moulin. All these elements could be considered as anecdotal if they did not reveal, to a certain extent, a cruel loss of prestige. In contemporary France, resistance is still a reference, but is to a certain extent obliged to defend itself, which was obviously not the case 20 or 30 years before. But if the myth has collapsed, we can say also, as Robert Paxton has said, that the history of the resistance has not yet been written. In fact, to write a history of the French resistance is quite a difficult task. Remember that the archives have been closed to a large extent until 1979, which means that history had been mostly based upon oral testimonies, or, I regret to say that, resistors have been very often true liars. So it's a problem, you see, to base a history of the resistance just upon the resistors' testimony. The resistance myth also has been so strong that many historians have for a long time obeyed a kind of self-censure, as much as many veterans were quite powerful. Just think of de Gaulle, just think of François Mitterrand. So this trend has vanished, okay, but it has not totally disappeared in contemporary France. So this broad picture incites to deal with two main mythic topics. Has resistance played a military part? And, second part, has it been able to involve a majority of French in the struggle? You may notice that I am using a plan which is in two parts, which is quite a crime for a French. Generally, we use three parts, so I'm sorry of this kind of betrayal. So the first question is, has the French resistance played a military part? So, to deal with this very important stake, first obliged to consider the matrix of the French resistance. Has it been an autochthonous or an exogenous phenomenon? Well, the two of them, we could say, as three main actors intervened in the process: the Gaullists, the Brits, and the French. So, the Gaullists. The Gaullist mythology has always considered that resistance as a whole was the result of the famous appeal launched by General de Gaulle. You see, the picture has been taken in 1941, but this is to a certain extent a kind of iconic photograph of de Gaulle. The idea, so, that resistance was born thanks to the appeal betrays both reality and de Gaulle's vision. So, back to basics. What was de Gaulle's vision? According to him, war in 1940 was not over because it was a world war. It was hence important to maintain France in the war, in order to allow her to be considered after the war as a winner. So to do so, de Gaulle refused to create a legion fighting with the Brits, and he preferred to build a counter-state in England and then, as you know, in Algeria. This state, he asserted, would be able to embody the true France and to capitalize on a national basis its military gains. So, to make France survive in the war, de Gaulle tried to rally some French colonies, such as the Afrique équatoriale française. He created, as you know, 3 French forces which fought in the desert, in Libya, and then in Italy. And he organized secret services, the BCRA, Bureau Central de Renseignement et d'Action, which were the Gaullist secret services, which were led by Colonel Passy. So the BCRA was supposed to create what we call networks in occupied France, which received 3 main tasks. First of all, gathering military information to give this military information to the Allies, such as, for example, the German order of battle. It was equally supposed to help Allied soldiers, mostly pilots, to be rescued. And it was also supposed to sabotage German resources. And here you have a famous raid which had been made at Bruneval in Seine-Maritime. It was a radar station, and the Brits were quite anxious to know what was the scientific device, what were the scientific devices the Germans used. So they sent a party to this. They destroyed the radar, and they took some parts of the radar, and even a German officer who was serving the radar station and who was supposed to give some information. This raid has taken place in February 1942. But all these priorities clearly show that de Gaulle was not leading a crusade against the evil Axis. Vichy inner policy was not much criticized because de Gaulle considered that Pétain's main crime was not to have built an authoritarian regime, but to have signed the Chani Armistice. That means that denouncing the National Revolution or the anti-Semitic persecution were clearly not de Gaulle's main goals, even if de Gaulle, of course, hatred on a personal ground this awful policy. That means also that de Gaulle was not interested in involving the French in the struggle. War was supposed to be led by specialists, regular soldiers and secret agents, even if these secret agents were sometimes amateurs, for example, inhabitants of Brest, able to describe the movements of the Kriegsmarine, for example. To a large extent, the Brits shared these views. In 1940, as you know, Churchill has created a special organization, the SOE, Special Operations Executive, which was supposed to set Europe ablaze. So to do so, the SOE created networks which were spying, sabotaging, and rescuing Allied soldiers. But the Brits were quite reluctant to arm the French and were certainly not planning nor gambling on a guerrilla. They did not want an uprising for two main reasons. First of all, they feared severe reprisals on the one hand, and on the other hand, they were afraid to attract German divisions, German forces to the French theater of operations, which in case of a landing in northern France would be disastrous for obvious strategic reasons. So for all these reasons, the Brits refused for a long time to give weapons to the French resistance and were opposed to the Maquis and the French. The French have been struck by the defeat, and the majority of them were confident in Philippe Pétain. But a few of them wanted to do something. Their aim, however, was not necessarily a military one. Some, of course, wanted to help the Allies and the British at first to win the war. They hence joined the networks which were working for the BCRA, the SOE, or even the Vichy's secret services. For them, war was an overriding priority. For the others, however, war was not the main problem. They knew, and I think that they were right, that they were totally unable to threaten the German forces, especially in 1940-1941. So they were fearing occupation, which was, according to them, a real and concrete risk. Nazism jeopardized the French South. Resistance had hence for first goal to preserve and to protect against the Germans, which were plundering the country, which were also trying, or were supposed to do so, to Nazify the country. So these men and women tried to create a new form of organization, the movement. A movement was supposed to steer public opinion, and it often diffused clandestine leaflets such as Libération, Combat, Défense de la France. You have here the first kind of leaflets. So you see they are not very well printed, it's on a very, very bad paper, but after the quality improved and the clandestine leaflets were even able to publish photographs, which was quite impressive because, of course, they were clandestine and prosecuted by the Gestapo or the Vichy's police. Giving the good information was the best way to contradict the lies of the Germans or of the Vichy's propaganda. But the clandestine newspapers could also, in a second step, mobilize the French in a kind of secret army. And in a third step, this secret army would be able to help the Allied forces just before and after their landings. Many movements, of course, were keen to help the Allies by rescuing their pilots, by giving the Allies some piece of information, but these tasks, however, were not their primary goal. So I think that we can consider that there is a gap between the networks and the movements, because the networks were leading the war and the other were resisting the German occupation. The first were struggling for victory, and the second were claiming for liberation. And liberation and victory, it's not the same kettle of fish. And the resistance was diverse from the outset. It was, above all, very weak. In Great Britain, just a few volunteers joined the secret services, which were not well considered, because the shadow war was not a war of gentlemen. It was dangerous also, as secret agents were not protected by Geneva Conventions. In occupied France, resistance was also very dangerous. So we can give an estimation, a rough estimation. In 1941, I think that resistance on the whole amounted 30,000 people on a global population of 40 million. It was, in fact, a very risky job. But I think also that another element played a great part. I mean that the movements were unable to give clear instructions, clear guidelines to the population. What could they say? They just say, adopt a dignified attitude. Avoid, for example, to trade with the Germans. Avoid, for the ladies, to sleep with the Germans. But after that, what was possible? Nothing was possible to be done, because they had no weapons, they had no instructions, the Allies were not supposed to land in France. So the resistance movements were to a certain extent in a deadlock. They were totally unable to propose concrete ways of fighting. Even the assassination of German soldiers, which were praised by the communists on and after August 1941, were not an efficient means of action. And they involved such bloody reprisals that even the communists told that they were not due to the Communist Party, that they were due to mavericks, people doing that on their own idea and not obeying communist instruction. So, to a certain extent, the resistance was in a deadlock. But a New Deal occurred in 1942. First of all, many French were confident in the Vichy regime, but the Vichy regime lost many assets in 1942. The empire was freed by the Allies, thanks to the landing in North Africa. The Germans invaded in retaliation the so-called Free Zone in November 1942, and the French state showed that it was unable to protect its citizens. It was unable to protect the citizens against war, as the bombings on metropolitan France began. Food rationing increased, and the Vichy regime enforced forced labor. Generally, forced labor is supposed to have been introduced in February 1943, where 3 classes of draftees were called on. But remember that a law on the 4th of September 1942 has played a more important role. On a global amount of 6,050,000 workers, more than 300,000 have been sent to Germany because of this law of September 1942, which has been quite a surprise at the beginning of the 21st century, when French historians have discovered this datum. So, forced labor has been a very, very important element for the resistance in occupied France. Because, as you know, many French were reluctant to work in Germany, even if many were not so reluctant to work for Germany. But to work in Germany and to work for Germany is not the same thing. So many of them became draft dodgers, which was both a chance and a burden for the inner resistance. Forced labor was obviously a great asset for the inner resistance. First of all, because it increased the number of volunteers. Of course, all draft dodgers did not join the resistance. Many tried to dodge with the system, for example, by working in the mines. which was a way to escape requisition. Others, probably 250,000, just hid. But the rest, and the rest, that means 50,000 people, which was quite a very impressive amount, joined the underground and often went to the maquis. Forced labor equally offered another opportunity to the resistance. The movements were able to give clear guidelines to the population, and their orders were easy to obey. It was not so difficult, for example, to hide a man in a farm. It was not so difficult to give him false papers in a small village. So, from this point of view, forced labor has been a great opportunity for the inner resistance. But it has also been a burden, because the French movements were supposed to feed and to shelter thousands of volunteers, and they were not prepared to do so. So all these elements have obliged the inner resistance and the Gaullists to reconsider their relations. And that is certainly the third element of the 1942 New Deal. At the very beginning, as I have told, de Gaulle was not really interested in the movements, but he progressively changed his mind, because de Gaulle realized that they could offer the basis for a secret army. And he equally realized that the movements could broaden his legitimacy. So he was keen to control them for military as for political purposes. To be efficient, the movement had to be integrated in the global war led by the Allies, and this goal required a unique command. So, political and military reasons combined to incite de Gaulle to impose a tight control on these forces. But the movements, on the other hand, needed de Gaulle's help. Because in 1942 they were growing, which means that they needed money and they needed weapons, especially in the maquis after November 1942. So the link between the two banks of the Channel had to be strengthened. For this reason, de Gaulle sent a delegate, Jean Moulin, you have seen the photograph, in occupied France in January 1942. He had three main tasks: to unite the movements in the south, to organize a secret army, and in a second step, which intervened in February 1943, to create a National Council of the Resistance, Conseil National de la Résistance, which was supposed to gather all French political parties, all French trade unions, and the main resistance movements. I don't want to spare much time on these questions, but to a large extent, Moulin have succeeded in this mission. So the networks and the movements were more closely linked to London thanks to Jean Moulin, and to a certain extent they obeyed de Gaulle's rule. But what were they supposed to do? De Gaulle, I have said that, attached the greatest importance to military intelligence, and from this point of view, the BCRA and the SOE have really been efficient. Many telegrams informed the Allied of the German defenses. According, for example, to General Donovan, who was in charge of the OSS, 80% of the information used to prepare Overlord have been given by the French resistance. For the sabotages, however, the French resistance was less successful. Just a few sabotages occurred before D-Day. So, of course, you have here a kind of iconic photograph showing French saboteurs of the railway network. You have here the result of an attack in January 1944. But all these sabotages made before June 1944 have not really put in danger the German war machine. But the French resistors received a special mission for D-Day. They were supposed to enforce plans supposed, for example, to paralyze the railway network. And the result of the action, launched on the 5th of June 1944, has been a success. And its main result was to slow the reinforcement of the German troops. So, sabotages on the one hand and the intelligence on the other were quite important. But they were not the only missions devoted to the French resistance. Two other possibilities remained open, the Maquis and the national uprising. Many young men joined the Maquis in 1943. So they went to the mountain and they hid themselves. But what were they supposed to do? To hide or to fight? The British were totally opposed to the Maquis, which were, according to them, a total nonsense, since no landing was planned. As you know, the decision for Overlord has been taken at the end of November 1943. Hence, they refused to give them weapons as much as the air preferred bombing, and so the air refused to divert their precious bombers for such aleatory gains. The Gaullists were a little bit more open, although they thought that the Maquis were not ready to fight. But they hoped that the Maquis could play a role during the liberation of the country. And according to them, two main Maquis could intervene. In the Vercors, in the French Alps, and the aim of the Maquis was to secure the Rhône Valley, and in Montchet, in the Massif Central, to cut a possible German retreat from the Atlantic coast. And the movements, at last, were equally divided. The communists disliked the Maquis, because according to them, the fight had to be led in town, and not in the countryside, for a useless guerrilla. The other forces were less reluctant, even if they did not really know which strategy was to be enforced. Was the Maquis supposed to hide clandestine soldiers who will fight just before the Allied landing, or could it launch offensive before? And this question was not really settled at the eve of the 6th of June. Were the French at last supposed to make an insurrection? In April 1942, de Gaulle, quite incautiously, had launched a famous motto. According to him, national liberation and national uprising were to be closely linked. And this formula was retaken by the communists, but, as you may suppose, for other reasons. In fact, de Gaulle favored an uprising, but it subordinated this uprising to two conditions. It had to be as short as possible, and it had to be closely linked to the progression of the Allied troops. The communists, on the contrary, were anxious to launch an insurrection as soon as possible. Their dream was to welcome de Gaulle not as a liberator, but in a country freed by their own forces, which was not the same process. The 6th of June, the Allied landed in Normandy. And the plans, as I have said, were to a large extent a success, especially for railways. But the Maquis were not. The Marquis du Vercors, for example, grew in June and July 1944. And you see here a kind of very peaceful photograph showing these young men living as scouts in the Vercors. But the Germans decided to destroy the Maquis in July, and the result was terrible. You see here the cemetery of Moret. More than 840 French were killed, and among them more than 200 civilians. And the same story occurred at Montchet and to a certain extent at Saint-Marcel in Brittany. So, generally speaking, the Maquis have been a failure for two main reasons. The Allies have not really supported them because they were not interesting from a strategic point of view, and they were totally unable to fight a regular army, especially the German one, especially the Wehrmacht. The uprising was equally a failure. of course, it's very difficult for us to understand this failure because we think of Paris, we think of the city of lights. But Paris is an exception and is certainly not the rule. In fact, on the main French cities, 212, only 5 made an insurrection, which was quite a poor result. Why? Because first of all, the communists were too weak to launch alone an uprising, because the resistors were poorly armed, and because, of course, the French had no time to write, either because of the German retreat ordered by Hitler on the 16th of August 1944, or because of the fastness of the Allied advance after Cobra at the end of July 1944, the great thrust launched by Brackley. After that, the French territory has been very, very quickly liberated, so there was no room for a French insurrection. So, on the whole, has the French resistance played a military part? This question requests a balanced answer. Yes, if we consider the question in terms of piece of intelligence, in terms equally of sabotages, but certainly not if we take into account the maquis. So we can consider that France would have been liberated with or without the French resistance. Does it mean, however, that the French have been passive? Have they just adopted during the war a wait-and-see attitude rather than to commit themselves in the struggle? This is, of course, a very, very difficult question, and I would like now to deal with this question with the question of commitment. First of all, we have to mention that the German occupation has always been unpopular. Collaboration has never been a popular motto, and a majority of French hated the Germans. This hate was sometimes based upon a very strong traditional Germanophobia, which was of course fueled by the remembrance of the First World War, but it was also sometimes fueled by a very strong anti-Nazism. This feeling, however, did not prevent the French to work for the Germans or to trade with them. And you know that the Swiss historian Philippe Burin has clearly shown that many French have adopted a strategy of accommodation with the Germans. But accommodation was, I think, more a way to survive than to support the Nazi new order. We have, hence, to make a clear distinction between the logics of opinion and the logics of action. Many French were against the German occupiers, but just a few were ready to fight them. And so this discrepancy has to be taken into consideration. First of all, resistance has often been presented as an ideological fight, mobilizing, for example, patriots or anti-fascists. This vision, of course, is true, for ideology has played an important part in commitment. But you cannot consider just ideology as a single element, because resistors were, of course, fighting for values, freedom, human rights, and so on. But I think that if the values were important, the hierarchy of the values were much more important. Just take 2 examples. Philippe Henriot and Henri Becquard. Philippe Henriot and Henri Becquard were 2 members of the French Parliament before the war. They belonged to the same party, the Fédération Républicaine. Both were, which was a rightist party. Both were anti-communist. Both were Catholics. Both were nationalists. Both agreed with Pétain's national revolution. Henriot, however, supported collaboration, but Becquard joined the resistance as soon as in 1940, as soon as 1940. Why? Because Henriot thought that anti-Bolshevism had to prevail. And so, when the Reich launched its crusade against Moscow, Henriot thought that it was his duty to support this kind of crusade. Bécard, on the contrary, thought that the French nation had to preserve its independence towards Germany. And so he broke with Pétain as soon as October 1940. He wrote telegrams to Pétain saying, your policy, your inner policy is marvelous, your ideas are marvelous, but first of all, just put the Germans out of France, and after enforce this marvelous policy. So you see, the same values have involved very different consequences. And the same dilemma struck the communists, because the leaders wanted to stick to Soviet Union. So until June 1941, they focused their attacks against Vichy, and they carefully avoided to criticize the Germans because, of course, of the German-Soviet Pact of 1939. But others, on the contrary, were upset by the defeat, and their primary aim was to fight Nazi Germany. And so they immediately got involved in the struggle as Georges Guingouin in the Limousin. But you cannot say that you are a resistor if you do not lead an action. So, how to lead an action? This action, I think, had to obey two rules. It had, first of all, to respect your own principles. And from this point of view, it was not always obvious. It was, for example, very difficult for a Christian to kill a German because of the fifth command, thou shalt not kill. And another element was also very important. The action was supposed to be efficient, because it was a risky one. But what does efficient mean? For many officers, for example, to distribute clandestine leaflets was totally childish. You cannot win a war by distributing clandestine leaflets. You cannot defeat an enemy with mere words. For a Christian, on the contrary, words were crucial. In the beginning was the word. So commitment was, to a certain extent, the result of supply and demand. On the first side, the resistance organizations, as we have seen, have been unable for a long time to give clear instructions to the French. But many French were not ready to commit themselves because they thought that the means of action were totally useless. And one very good example, I think, is André Malraux. André Malraux, who was a very bold man, who had been very courageous during the Spanish War, who had been very courageous in 1939 because he enlisted himself. He was not obliged to fight in the French army, so he volunteered to be a draftee, but he refused to support resistance. And when a famous resistor, Claude Bourdet, came to see him, Malraux said, "Do you have money? Do you have weapons? No? Okay, come back when you will get arms and money." So these elements show, I think, the importance of cultural factors. All social groups were not able to face the situation in the same way. To a certain extent, some were ready to fight, to face clandestine life, for example, but others were not. But what does ready mean? I think that it means two things. First of all, I think that some groups were quite gifted to commit themselves in the resistance because of their repertory of action, this concept invented by Charles Tilly. Each group, Charles Tilly says, has its own repertory of action. For example, a communist knew how to demonstrate, how to strike, how to make leaflets, and he had sometimes a war experiment, especially when he had fought during the Spanish Civil War. He was, of course, sometimes accustomed to clandestine life. The 21 conditions imposed in 1990 to join the Comintern obliged the French Communist Party to create a secret apparatus. And remember also that the French Communist Party had been forbidden in September 1939, so many leaders died in clandestine life. For all these reasons, the communists were to a large extent ready to get involved in the resistance. But it was not the case, for example, of a basic student. What did he know? He had nothing to offer, except maybe his ability to think and to write. And this datum explains why so many students joined movements rather than networks. Ready equally meant that pre-war cultures interfered with commitment, and especially political culture. Political landmarks help to identify the enemy, but to identify an enemy is not always obvious. For us, for example, it's obvious that Nazism was the evil, but for Henriot, Bolshevism was a much greater evil. For a very rightist officer, Pétain was not a traitor. So to identify a foe is not obvious, and here in the American context we could ask a question: are the Tea Party friends or foe of the Republican Party? It's a good question, I think, for the Republicans to be asked. So you see, the recognition of a foe is not really easy. The same for us, for example, the ecologists for the Green in France. Are they friends or foes of the socialists? It's a very, very difficult question to cope with. So some cultural backgrounds helped to disobey. And I think that this datum has to be, for example, considered when you see the difference between the Jews and the Christian Democrats. What was a Christian Democrat before the war in France? First of all, he had no confidence in Hitler, not at all. It was not so common in the Catholic world. Remember that a concordat had been signed between Berlin and the Vatican in 1934, and many Catholics thought that Nazism was a bulwark against Bolshevism. In France, Christian Democrats were immunized against such an illusion because they considered that Nazism was a paganism. During the interwar period, their press had warned against the Nazi threats. And so, to a certain extent, Christian Democrats were immunized against any illusion. They were equally reluctant toward Pétain, and it was not so common, you see, in the Catholic world of occupied France, because they aimed to reconcile the Church and the Republic rather than to restore a moral order. And they were not afraid to disobey, because they used to do so. Rome had condemned them several times. In 1910, when the Sillon had been led to self-dissolution. In 1934, when Set-7, a Dominican review, was considered as a communist review and had been obliged to dissolve itself. They were not afraid to die, because in the 30s, spirituality praised martyrdom and preferred to exalt Jesus Christ, dead on the Holy Cross, rather than the comforting Mary. Last but not least, resistance was, to a certain extent, assimilated to a return to an original purity. A persecuted minority was leading a desperate struggle, as the first Christians did in the catacombs. And for all these reasons, the Christian Democrats got involved in the Shadow Army as soon as 1940. Just such story has not been the case for many Jews, except the communists. Because many Jews were totally confident in France, which was the country of human rights. Many of them did not believe that Pétain could deliver them to the Germans. From a cultural point of view, many Jews were not ready to disobey the law. because to respect the law was a way to show that they were faithful to France. It was equally a way to put aside a common criticism amplified by the Dreyfus affair. Jews were cowards and potential traitors. Many Jews equally thought that their sacrifice could be a way to avoid France to pay a higher tribute to the Germans. And one example clearly shows this trend. René Guastalla, he is not very famous, but he was a teacher in philosophy, and as a Jewish teacher, he was obliged to resign. But what did he do? He devoted his last class to Socrates. And you know that Socrates has preferred to obey the laws of Athens, even if they were unjust, rather than to transgress them. So the example given to the students was not revolt, was not insurrection. It was, do as I do. I am drinking the ciguë, rather than to disobey the Athenian law, rather than to transgress the Athenian law. So it's time to conclude. Just 3 points. First, from a military point of view, the French resistance has been an asset, but this asset has just played a minor part in the liberation of the country. The Allies would have won the war with the French resistance as without it. 2. Resistance has remained a minor phenomenon in occupied France, which could appear paradoxical, taken into account the Germans' unpopularity. Commitment, however, did not obey to feelings. It also depended on what resistance organizations were able to offer, and from this point of view, the guidelines were quite poor until 1942 or even 1943. Commitment equally depended on cultural factors. The way, for example, you considered efficiency, your repertories of actions, and all these elements were very different according to social or cultural groups. We can hence consider that resistance has gathered just a minority of French, for all these reasons, maybe 500,000 in 1944. These two elements are, of course, deeply linked. Resistance has not been able to play a major role because it has always been weak. And this datum explains, for example, that the national uprising, planned, even in a different way, both by the communists and the Gaullists, has been a failure. But this failure, however, mustn't hide another datum. Resistance has been strong enough to avoid a civil war and to proceed in a very peaceful way. The devolution of power between the Vichy regime and the Gaullist regime have been very peaceful. This has not been the case, for example, in Greece. That means that I think that resistance has played a very important role, but on a political ground. That is, as you may suppose, another story. Thank you.